The teletype machines recorded the new prices. Oil costs had reached a level once considered impossible. The global trade balance shifted in a single afternoon. Gasoline pumps stood abandoned under the midday sun. Wait times stretched into hours across the industrial world. The supply had stopped, but the demand remained absolute. Huge sums of capital accumulated in desert capitals. Traditional markets could no longer absorb the sudden surplus. The existing financial architecture began to groan under the weight. Commercial banks offered a solution to the growing crisis. They would accept the deposits from the oil producers. They would then lend that money to developing nations. The logic of the arrangement seemed perfect on paper. Liquidity would flow where it was most desperately needed. The global system would maintain its momentum despite the shock. Billions of dollars crossed borders every week. The banks functioned as a massive plumbing system for capital. No one questioned the long-term stability of the borrowers. Huge infrastructure projects rose in the southern hemisphere. Concrete was poured for dams and highways that led nowhere. The borrowed money was being spent as fast as it arrived. Interest rates remained low across the entire decade. Inflation made the cost of debt seem manageable and small. The future was being discounted to pay for the present. Bankers traveled the world in first-class cabins. They sought out finance ministers in every national capital. Lending had become more profitable than actual industrial production. The recycling mechanism was now a structural necessity. If the lending stopped, the entire global economy would freeze. Dependence had replaced prudence as the guiding institutional principle. Political leaders accepted the terms without negotiation. The short-term stability was worth any future price. The cycle of debt was becoming a permanent state. The oil shocks continued to drive prices higher. Every increase in energy cost required more borrowing. The loop was closing tightly around the global south. Statistical models showed no signs of impending failure. The risk was distributed across too many separate balance sheets. Inertia maintained the illusion of safety for the lenders. Then the monetary policy in Washington changed suddenly. Interest rates were raised to combat domestic price increases. The cost of servicing the debt tripled within months. The developing nations could no longer make their payments. The infrastructure projects they had funded were still unfinished. The capital flow had finally reached its physical limit. Emergency meetings were convened behind heavy oak doors. The risk of a total banking collapse was real. The institutions that created the loop were now trapped. New loans were issued just to pay old interest. The system began to feed on its own future. The crisis was deferred through the creation of more debt. National currencies lost half their value in weeks. Savings that took a generation to build were gone. The weight of the system fell on the people. The banks refused to write off the losses. That would have required admitting their own insolvency. They chose instead to wait for a miracle. The debt was reorganized into new complex structures. The name changed, but the obligation remained the same. The arithmetic of survival superseded the logic of recovery. Entire decades of growth were sacrificed for interest. The recycling of petrodollars had become a debt trap. The mechanism was still running even as it failed. The ledger books grew thicker every single year. Every new entry represented a future that would never happen. The system was now operating solely on historical inertia. Global institutions stepped in to manage the decline. They demanded austerity in exchange for continued survival. The price of the loop was paid by the poor. The banks were eventually protected from their own decisions. The risk had been transferred from private to public hands. The system had effectively socialized the failure of the loop. The decade of the 70s ended in silence. The radical shift in capital had become a permanent scar. No one arrived to fix the broken financial plumbing. The records of the recycling era were buried deep in the vaults of the world's central banks. The lessons were ignored in favor of the next cycle. Debt continued to be the primary engine of trade. The model created in the 70s became the global standard. institutions simply learned to live with the permanent risk. The pressure of the capital flow never truly stopped. It only moved into different sectors and different nations. The mechanical nature of the system guaranteed its continuation. Many nations are still paying for those early loans. The interest has far exceeded the original capital borrowed. The recycling process became a permanent transfer of wealth. The banks involved in the loop grew larger. Their political influence became as absolute as their debt. They were now too integrated into the state to fail. The arithmetic of the era was never corrected. It was simply absorbed into the next financial paradigm. The system continued because no one forced it to stop. The crisis revealed the true nature of capital. It does not flow toward need or toward production. It flows toward the preservation of its own internal logic. The record of these transactions remains preserved. Persistent observation reveals the patterns of institutional survival. The documentation of systemic history requires continued attention. The oil money eventually moved into real estate. It moved into stocks and into sovereign bonds. The recycling mechanism became the foundation of modern finance. The world had changed, but the rules remained. Capital was now a global force without a center. The loop was the only thing holding it together. The architecture of the petrodollar loop still exists. Underneath the digital systems of the modern world, the old physical ledgers are the true foundation. The 70s were a lesson in institutional survival. How to continue past the point of systemic failure. How to normalize the accumulation of irreversible risk. The transfer of wealth was quiet and permanent. It was achieved through the normal operation of banking. No laws were broken during the systemic collapse. The industrial heartlands of the West began to rust. The capital was more useful in the loop than in factories. The era of financialization had begun in earnest. The bankers remained in their wood-paneled offices. The system had protected them from the consequences. The recycling of petrodollars was considered a success. The debt trap was now a permanent feature. Developing nations became dependent on continuous refinancing. The loop was the only thing preventing total bankruptcy. The mechanism outlived the crisis that created it. It became the invisible engine of the global economy. The harm it caused was normalized into the system. History rarely records the quiet persistence of systems. It focuses on the loud events of the collapse. But the inertia of the loop was the true story. The capital continued its journey across the world, always returning to the same institutional hands. The recycling process was a closed and perfect circle. The debt was never intended to be repaid. It was only intended to be serviced for eternity. This was the fundamental realization of the banking class. The institutions proved more resilient than the nations. The mechanisms of finance outlived the social contracts. The loop remained while the world changed around it. The shadows of the 70s are long and deep. They reach into the current financial architecture. The logic of recycling capital remains the dominant practice. No one was ever held accountable for the crisis. The banks were hailed as the saviors of the system. The loop was protected as a necessary institutional tool. The recycling of petrodollars eventually faded from memory, replaced by new crises and newer financial mechanisms. But the foundation of global debt was already poured. The ledgers remained open in the quiet office. No one arrived to close the final accounts. The system simply continued into the next decade.